Imagine you're standing at the edge of the Moselle Estate in rural South Carolina. The air is thick here, even in the morning. There is something about the way the light falls through the Spanish moss, the way it filters down through the canopy of ancient live oaks and touches the earth in pale, uncertain patches, that makes you feel as though the land itself is holding something back. The house sits far from the road, far enough that you cannot hear traffic, far enough that a scream would dissolve into the fields before it reached anyone who might care to listen. This is the place where a mother and her son were found brutally murdered on their own family property. To understand how something like this could happen, we have to go back. We have to go back past the yellow crime scene tape and the sheriff's vehicles parked at crooked angles in the red dirt driveway. We have to go back past the grief and the courtroom and the headlines that reduced an entire family's tragedy to a single sensational sentence. We have to go back to the beginning of something that was already broken long before anyone died. Because that is the only honest way to tell a story like this one. Not from the end, but from the roots. And the roots of the Moselle Estate run deep. Before we go further into this story, if you have found yourself here, standing at the edge of something you cannot quite name, drawn to the quiet weight of hidden histories and the secrets that old homes carry in their walls, then this channel was made for you. Whispering Estates exists for those who want to understand not just what happened, but why, and what it felt like to live inside it. If that speaks to something in you, we would be so grateful if you would subscribe and leave a like on this video. It helps more people find these stories, and it means everything to those of us who believe that the truth deserves to be told slowly and with care. Now let us go back. Let us go all the way back to the land. South Carolina has a particular quality of silence that people from other places sometimes mistake for peace. The fields in the Low Country stretch wide and flat, interrupted only by stands of trees and the occasional structure, a barn, a water tower, a farmhouse with a wraparound porch whose boards have been softening in the humidity for a century or more. In the spring, the landscape is overwhelmingly green. In the summer, it is oppressive in the most beautiful possible way, the kind of beauty that demands something from you, that costs you something just to stand inside of it. And in the fall, when the light changes and the air finally offers some relief, there is a melancholy that settles over the fields like a second skin. The Moselle Estate was not simply a house, it was a statement. It was the physical embodiment of a family's belief in itself, in its own importance, in its permanence, in a world that has very little patience for permanence. The property spanned thousands of acres. There were hunting lands and wetlands and forested areas where deer moved at dusk like shadows given breath. There was a main house and a guest cottage and kennels for the hunting dogs. And all of it sat at the end of a long private road that announced, clearly and without apology, that you were entering somewhere that did not belong to you. The family at the center of this story had lived in this part of South Carolina for generations. Their name was known in the county long before any of the children now carrying it were born. It was the kind of name that appeared on the donor walls of local institutions, the kind of name that commanded a certain deference in certain rooms, the kind of name that opened doors without a knock. To the outside world, to the people who passed their estate on the road and glimpsed the roofline through the trees, the family represented a version of Southern success that felt almost mythological. Old money, old land, old certainty. But the most important thing to understand about families like this one is that the myth and the reality rarely share the same room. Alex Murdaugh was born into this family in the summer of 1968 in Hampton County, South Carolina. He grew up inside the weight of the Murdaugh name, inside its expectations and its privileges and its particular form of pressure, which was the pressure of never being allowed to be ordinary. His grandfather, his father, and his uncle had all served as solicitors for the 14th Judicial Circuit of South Carolina, a stretch of legal authority that covered a significant and deeply rural portion of the state. For decades, the Murdaughs had been the law in Hampton County, not merely lawyers, the law itself. This distinction matters more than it might initially seem. When a family holds prosecutorial power over a community for 3 consecutive generations, something happens to the relationship between that family and the concept of accountability. The community begins to understand, not through any explicit statement, but through accumulated experience, that the Murdaughs exist in a different category, that the ordinary consequences which govern ordinary lives do not necessarily apply to them, that there is a kind of invisible architecture around the family, a structure built from professional power and social connection and sheer historical weight that redirects scrutiny away and closes ranks when trouble approaches. Alex absorbed all of this growing up. He absorbed the entitlement the way children absorb everything through the atmosphere of a home, through the way adults speak and move and relate to one another and to the world outside. He grew up watching his father practice law with a commanding presence, watching the way men in suits deferred to the Murdaugh name, watching the way the family moved through Hampton County as though they had been assigned to it by some higher authority. And in many ways, they had been. In that community, at that time, the Murdaugh family was the higher authority. He attended the University of South Carolina for his undergraduate education, and then went on to law school, following the path that had been laid for him before he could walk. He joined the family law firm, Peters, Murdaugh, Parker, Elsroth, and Dietrich, which the community simply called PMPED. And there he built a career as a personal injury attorney, working the other side of the legal equation from his family's prosecutorial legacy. He became known as a persuasive, charismatic attorney, the kind of man who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave it full of people who felt they knew him. He married a woman named Maggie. Maggie Murdaugh, born Maggie Kennedy, was the kind of woman that certain communities both admire and quietly diminish at the same time. She was beautiful and well-dressed and devoted to her family in the particular way that women of her social position are expected to be devoted, which is to say, completely, and often without acknowledgement. She managed the social life of the family with grace, maintained the household, raised their 2 sons, and moved through Hampton County society with the poise of someone who understood that her role was to make everything look effortless. But what was Maggie actually like behind the effortlessness? This is the question that haunts any honest account of her life. Because the women who carry these households, who smooth the rough edges of their husbands' personalities and translate family chaos into social coherence, are so rarely given the space to simply be themselves. They exist in a kind of relational service, their identities so deeply woven into the needs and expectations of the people around them that the private self becomes harder and harder to locate. People who knew Maggie described her as warm, genuinely warm, not the performed warmth of someone playing a role, but the real kind, the kind that made you feel noticed in her presence. She was funny in the dry, understated way of someone who has learned to observe closely. She loved her sons fiercely. She loved the dogs and the land and the particular rhythms of life on the estate. And she loved Alex. Or at least, she had loved Alex. or at least she had loved the version of Alex that she had understood herself to be building a life with. Whether she fully understood who that man actually was, whether she saw beneath the surface of their shared life to what was happening underneath, is one of the most painful questions in this entire story. Their older son, Buster, grew up and found his own path through adulthood, navigating the particular burden of being a Murdaugh in Hampton County, which is to say, the burden of a name that precedes you into every room and does not always serve you as you might hope. He attended law school, following the family tradition, though his path through it was not without its own complications. Their younger son was named Paul. Paul Murdaugh was 22 years old at the time of his death. He was, by most accounts, a young man who contained multitudes in the way that young men often do, which is to say, he was capable of genuine charm and also capable of genuine recklessness, and the two qualities lived in him side by side without apparent awareness of their contradiction. He had inherited his father's confidence and his mother's warmth, and he had also inherited, or perhaps simply absorbed, the particular belief that the Murdaugh name would protect him from the consequences of his worst impulses. In February of 2019, a boat that Paul was piloting on the Broad River near Beaufort capsized. There were 5 people on board. One of them, a young woman named Mallory Beach, was 19 years old. She did not survive. Her body was recovered from the water a week after the accident. Paul had been drinking that night. The blood alcohol evidence that emerged was deeply troubling. He was charged with 3 felony counts related to the accident. This moment, this single terrible night on the water, is essential to understanding everything that came after. Because the way a family responds to a crisis tells you everything about who they actually are, as opposed to who they present themselves to be. The Murdaughs responded to the boating accident in a way that was consistent with everything they had always been. They circled, they protected, they deployed their legal connections and their social capital and their institutional relationships, and they began the slow work of managing a crisis that, for any ordinary family, would have been catastrophic but manageable, and that, for the Murdaughs, had additional layers of complication because of the extraordinary professional and personal entanglement in which they existed. Paul was released. He returned to the estate. He continued his life on the property, while his legal case wound its slow way through a system that his family had spent 3 generations shaping. What did it feel like inside that house during those months? What did Maggie and Alex say to each other when the doors were closed and the pretense of normalcy was no longer required? What did Paul feel, navigating the grief and the guilt and the legal exposure, the knowledge that a young woman had died and that his choices had contributed to her death? These are questions without clean answers, but they are questions that matter because they tell us something about the emotional climate of the Moselle Estate in the months leading up to the night of June 7, 2021. Would you have noticed the tension if you had visited that house? If you had sat at their dinner table in those months, watching the careful way conversation was steered around certain topics, watching the way certain silences had a texture to them, a density that suggested they were holding things rather than simply being empty, would you have sensed that something was wrong? Or would the surface have been too polished, too practiced, too Murdaugh to let anything through? Alex was under pressure that extended far beyond the boating accident and its legal aftermath. He had been living a double life for decades, and the architecture of that double life had become so elaborate and so structurally unsound that it required constant, exhausting maintenance. He had developed a severe addiction to opioids, a fact that he would eventually disclose publicly in circumstances that were, to put it generously, complicated by their timing. He was spending extraordinary amounts of money on his addiction, money that he did not have, without taking it from places it did not belong to him. The Murdaugh law firm, PMPED, was a prestigious and successful operation, and over the course of his career there, Alex had quietly, methodically, and with considerable ingenuity been stealing from it. He had been stealing from clients, not small amounts, not the kind of diversion that could be explained away as sloppy accounting or a misunderstanding. He had stolen millions of dollars from some of the most vulnerable people his firm represented, people who had come to PMPED after suffering real and devastating losses, people who had trusted the Murdaugh name with their settlements, with their futures, with the financial compensation that was supposed to help them rebuild their lives. He stole from the family of Mallory Beach. The depth of this particular theft, its moral dimension, its breathtaking audacity, its suggestion of a man who had so thoroughly separated himself from normal human empathy that he could look at the mother of the young woman his son had helped to kill and take money meant for her grief, is something that resists easy psychological explanation. It is the kind of act that makes you wonder how someone arrives there, not in a single dramatic moment of moral failure, but gradually, through a long succession of smaller compromises and rationalizations and accommodations that accumulate over time into something that no longer resembles anything a person would recognize as themselves. Alex had also stolen from the estate of his former housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield, who had died in his home in February of 2018 after a fall that was initially attributed to tripping over the family's dogs. The details of her death and the handling of her estate became one of the most disturbing tributaries of the larger story, revealing an exploitation so cold and so calculated that it strips away any remaining possibility of excusing Alex's behavior as the desperate act of an addict in over his head. This was something more deliberate than desperation. This was predation, and all of it was beginning to unravel. By the spring and early summer of 2021, the financial deceptions that Alex had so carefully constructed were developing visible cracks. His partners at PMPED were beginning to ask questions that could not be answered with charm and deflection. The civil litigation surrounding the boating accident was proceeding in ways that threatened to expose financial records that Alex could not allow anyone to see. There were inquiries and inconsistencies and the particular low hum of institutional suspicion that precedes exposure. He was also, by his own later account, in the grip of his addiction in a way that was making clear thinking nearly impossible. The opioid dependency had progressed to a point where a significant portion of his mental and emotional resources was dedicated to maintaining it, funding it, concealing it, and managing the physical and psychological effects of a body and mind that had been reshaped by years of pharmaceutical dependency. This is not offered as an excuse, it is offered as context, because context is the only tool we have for understanding how a human being who had so many apparent reasons to protect his family arrived at the decisions he made. The Moselle Estate in the early summer of 2021 was a place under siege from within. The hunting season was over. The property had the particular quiet of late spring, the dog kennels still and warm, the fields green and heavy with moisture. The main house, with its comfortable, lived-in elegance, its family photographs and its hunting trophies, and its kitchen that had fed so many people over so many years, sat at the centre of the estate, like the eye of something the family could not yet see coming. Maggie was spending significant time at the family's beach house on Edisto Island that summer, a detail that has attracted considerable attention from those who have tried to understand the dynamics of the marriage in its final months. The separation, whether it was a natural rhythm of summer life for a family with multiple properties, or something more deliberate, something that suggested a woman creating distance from a situation she found increasingly difficult to occupy with her full self, is something we cannot know with certainty. What we know is that she was not always at Moselle. And we know that on the evening of June 7, 2021, she was. Alex called her that evening. He asked her to come to the estate. He told her that Paul was there and that the family should be together. She came. What was that drive like for Maggie, coming along the highway toward Hampton County, toward the property she had known for so many years, toward the husband and the younger son, and the particular complicated life she had been maintaining with such persistent grace? Was she happy to be going? Did she feel, as she turned onto the long private road and saw the house lights through the trees, the uncomplicated comfort of homecoming? Or was there something else in her, some low, nameless unease, the kind that women sometimes carry for months or years before they understand what it is telling them? We do not know what she felt. We only know what happened next. Paul was at the kennels that evening. He had been feeding and tending to the dogs, which was a regular part of his routine on the property. The kennels were set back from the main house, in a part of the estate that was darker and more isolated at night, surrounded by the sounds of the rural low country, the insects and the frogs, and the occasional movement of larger animals through the brush. It was a place where Paul was comfortable, a place that was part of the rhythms and textures of his life on the estate. Maggie went to him there. Alex was with them, or near them, at some point in the evening. At some point after 9 o'clock that night, Maggie Murdaugh and Paul Murdaugh were shot and killed. Maggie was 52 years old. Paul was 22. The weapons used were a rifle and a shotgun, both of which were consistent with firearms that the Murdaugh family owned and that were regularly used on the property for hunting. The violence was swift. The violence was decisive. The violence left a mother and her son on the ground of the estate that their family had held for generations, in a place that should have been the safest place in the world for them, in a place that was supposed to be home. At approximately 10 o'clock that evening, Alex Murdaugh called 911. His voice on that call was audibly distressed. He told the dispatcher that he had found his wife and son. He said they were both shot. He said he needed help. The first responders who arrived at the Moselle Estate that night found a scene that spoke of extraordinary violence. They found Alex Murdaugh in a state of apparent shock and grief. A man behaving in the way you might expect a husband and father to behave upon finding his family slaughtered. He was emotional. He was incoherent in the way that genuine trauma can sometimes make a person incoherent. He was, to the officers who arrived and the investigators who came after, a grieving man. For a time, the investigation treated him accordingly. The Murdaugh name still held weight, even in the immediate aftermath of a double homicide on the family property. The initial investigation moved carefully around the possibility that the family patriarch might himself be a suspect, a caution that reflected not merely professional procedure, but the accumulated cultural history of a name that had spent 3 generations being synonymous with the law itself. The investigators looked outward. They asked questions about Paul's enemies, about the boating accident and the family of Mallory Beach, about anyone who might have held a grievance against the Murdaughs significant enough to motivate an act of this kind. The theory of outside involvement was not unreasonable on its face. Paul Murdaugh had been involved in a tragedy that had destroyed another family. He was facing felony charges. There were people who had genuine, devastating reasons to feel rage toward him. The investigation properly considered these possibilities, but the evidence, as it accumulated, kept bending back toward the man who had made the 911 call. Cell phone data placed Alex Murdaugh at the kennel area at the time investigators believed the murders occurred, despite his initial claim that he had been at the main house, napping, before discovering the bodies. A video recording that Paul had made on his phone at the kennel that evening, a casual video of dogs in their runs, captured audio voices in the background. One of the voices on that recording was identified as Alex Murdaugh's, placing him at the scene during a window of time that he had told investigators he was elsewhere. The phones told a story that did not match the story Alex was telling. And then there was everything else. The financial crimes were unraveling in real time. Within months of the murders, Alex's partners at PMPED confronted him with evidence of the missing funds. In September of 2021, in a sequence of events so strange they seem almost scripted, Alex staged his own shooting on a roadside in Hampton County, calling a family friend and longtime associate, Curtis Smith, to assist him in what appears to have been an elaborate scheme to generate a life insurance payout. He was shot, non-fatally, by Smith at his request. He then called for help and presented himself as the victim of a random attack. It did not work. The scheme unraveled almost immediately, and the exposure of this bizarre episode, coming so close on the heels of the murders and the emerging financial investigation, stripped away the last remaining membrane of protection that the Murdaugh name had provided. The law that the family had embodied for 3 generations turned its full attention toward one of its own. Alex Murdaugh was charged with the murders of his wife and son. He was also charged with a staggering array of financial crimes. The full accounting of what he had stolen, from whom he had stolen it, and over what period of time he had sustained the deception, was so extensive that it seemed to exceed the capacity of a single human life to contain. He had stolen from bereaved families. He had stolen from his own partners. He had stolen from the estate of a woman who had died in his home. He had, in a very real sense, been living a life that was a crime, not in moments or lapses, but as a sustained condition of his existence. The trial of Alex Murdaugh began in January of 2023 in Walterboro, South Carolina. It became one of the most watched criminal proceedings in the history of South Carolina, perhaps in the recent history of American courtrooms. The courtroom was packed every day. The proceedings were live-streamed to an audience that stretched far beyond the state, far beyond the country, into the particular cultural space that true crime occupies in the contemporary imagination, a space where millions of people, many of them women, watch and listen and follow and discuss and try to understand. And what were they trying to understand? What draws so many people, particularly women, to stories like this one? The answer, or at least one honest answer, is that stories like this one illuminate something that women are taught, from a very young age, to overlook. They illuminate the danger that can exist inside the most ordinary and respectable-seeming domestic architecture. The Moselle Estate looked like safety. It looked like stability and tradition and the kind of rooted, established family life that our culture presents as the highest form of security available to women. And inside it, something terrible was being cultivated in plain sight. Women recognize this dynamic. They have been trained through socialization and through the literature of their lives to trust the surface of things, to accept the presentation of stability as its substance, to interpret a man's external success and social standing as evidence of his interior character. The Murdaugh story, in all its devastating complexity, is a story about what happens when that training leads someone directly toward harm. It is a story about a woman who, by every available external measure, was doing everything right, and who was still in the room with something she may not have been able to see clearly until it was too late. We must be careful here not to reduce Maggie Murdaugh to a cautionary tale or to a symbol. She was a person. She was a specific, irreplaceable person with a history and an interior life and relationships that mattered, and a future that should have extended decades further than it did. The danger of the true crime genre, the danger that this channel tries always to resist, is the reduction of victims to their victimhood, the flattening of full human lives into the single dimension of their worst moment. Maggie deserved better than her marriage. She deserved better than her end. And she deserves better than a narrative that makes her story only about the man who ended it. Let us take a moment to dwell with her as a person, in the time before. She had friends who loved her. She had a sense of humour that people remembered long after they expected to have forgotten the details of someone they had known casually. She had opinions about things, about the estate, and about her children, and about the rhythms of life in Hampton County, and those opinions were her own, formed from her own experience, not simply reflections of the people around her. She had a relationship with her faith that seemed genuine and not performed. She had, by all accounts, an extraordinary capacity for grace under conditions that would have broken people who had not developed her particular kind of quiet resilience. But quiet resilience, the kind that women develop inside difficult marriages and complicated family situations, is not the same thing as safety. Resilience is an adaptive mechanism. It is what a person develops when the environment requires it. And the fact that Maggie had developed so much of it, the fact that the people who knew her described a woman who could carry weight without letting it show, suggests something about the weight she had been carrying. The marriage to Alex, viewed from the outside through the lens of what we now know about his secret life, was a marriage in which Maggie was not fully known to the man she had built her life with, and in which the man she believed she knew was, in essential ways, not real. He had hidden from her the addiction. He had hidden the financial crimes. He had maintained a version of himself that was coherent and recognizable and familiar, while the actual self was doing things that would have been incomprehensible to anyone who loved him. Or perhaps she suspected more than she knew. This is one of the most quietly devastating questions in the whole account. Women who live long enough inside troubled marriages often develop a particular relationship with knowledge, a kind of managed unknowing, in which they understand that something is wrong, without allowing themselves to fully crystallize what that something is, because crystallizing it would require a response, and the response would cost more than they feel they can afford. This managed unknowing is not stupidity, and it is not weakness. It is a survival strategy inside a situation where full knowledge feels unbearable. Did Maggie know, or suspect, that the financial foundations of their life were rotten? Did she notice things that she chose not to examine too closely? Did she feel, in the months before her death, that the walls of their life together were developing cracks that could not simply be plastered over with the next social engagement, or the next family gathering, or the next performance of normalcy? We will never be able to answer these questions with certainty, but they matter. They matter because they are the questions that any woman in any difficult marriage might ask herself about her own situation, in the privacy of her own mind. In the hours when the performance is suspended and the actual weight of things becomes briefly visible. The boating accident had changed things in the Murdaugh household in ways that extended beyond the legal and social exposure. It had changed things because it had placed Paul, the younger son, at the centre of public scrutiny in a way that had consequences for everyone around him. Paul had been charged with felonies. Paul had been publicly identified as the person responsible for the death of a 19-year-old woman whose family was in legitimate and devastating grief. And the community's response to him, the anger and the judgment that he attracted, had created a kind of social siege around the entire family. For Maggie, this siege had a particular texture. As a mother, she was required to defend and support her son, whatever the circumstances. The maternal imperative to protect your child does not dissolve simply because the child has done something terrible. But defending Paul also meant being publicly associated with the worst narrative about the family, meant occupying a position that was uncomfortable and sometimes openly hostile, meant managing the social fallout of an event that she had played no part in causing and that she had no power to undo. What did it feel like to be Maggie Murdaugh at a social gathering in Hampton County in the 2 years between the boating accident and her death? What did it feel like to know that people in the room were looking at her differently, thinking about her differently, filtering every interaction through the knowledge of what her son had done and what her family name represented? The women who can answer this question are not rare. They are the women who have ever been defined by the worst behavior of a family member, who have ever worn someone else's shame in public, who have ever had to compose their face and walk into a room where judgment was waiting for them, like a piece of furniture they could not move. The Murdaugh name, which had once been a kind of armour in Hampton County, had become something more complicated. It was still powerful. It still carried weight and access and institutional protection. But it also carried now the shadow of the boating accident, and that shadow would grow in the months to come to encompass things that no one outside a very small circle yet knew. Paul himself, in the period between the boating accident and his death, was a young man living inside an impossible situation. He was on bond. He was under legal restriction. He was publicly reviled in some quarters and privately supported in others. The mental and emotional burden of having caused someone's death, of knowing that a family had been destroyed by something you did, and then having to continue living as a visible member of a prominent family in a small community where everyone knows everything, is a burden that most of us will never be required to carry. How he carried it is something we cannot fully know. People who knew him in those months described a young man who was trying to maintain his ordinary life while being anything but ordinary. A young man who still went hunting and tended the dogs and moved through the routines of the estate with apparent normalcy, while underneath, who can say what was moving? The kennels were his place. They were the part of the Moselle Estate most specifically associated with him in that period, the place where he was most himself, most comfortable, most removed from the social and legal pressures that had come to define the shape of his life. The dogs trusted him. The dogs did not know about the boating accident or the felony charges or the name he carried. They simply knew him as the person who fed them and cared for them and moved among them with the ease of someone who had grown up with animals on a working property. On the evening of June 7th, 2021, Paul was doing what he often did in the evenings on the estate. He was at the kennels. He was with the dogs. He was, in this final ordinary moment, doing something that was natural and unguarded and real. And then it was over. The investigation, once it turned fully toward Alex Murdaugh, began uncovering a timeline that was simultaneously straightforward and deeply disturbing. The cell phone evidence was central. Alex's phone data told a story of movement that evening that contradicted the account he had given investigators. The video on Paul's phone, with Alex's voice audible in the background, placed him at the scene. The trajectory of the physical evidence was consistent with someone who had been present, who had used weapons familiar to him, and who had then managed to transition into the role of grieving discoverer with sufficient speed to be the person who made the 911 call. This transition from perpetrator to grieving family member is one of the most psychologically disturbing elements of the entire case. Not because it is unprecedented. Human beings are capable of extraordinary compartmentalization under conditions of extreme stress and self-preservation, but because of what it requires. It requires, in that specific moment, the ability to stand over the bodies of your wife and your son, people you have known and lived with and shared your life with for decades and for years, and to begin performing a role, to compose your face and your voice into the shape of discovery and shock. To become, in that moment, the husband who found them, the father who lost them, rather than the man who chose this. The question of why haunts every serious examination of this case. There are practical answers that the prosecution assembled and presented to the jury. Alex Murdaugh was facing financial exposure that would have been catastrophic, not merely personally embarrassing, but criminally consequential. The civil litigation from the boating accident was threatening to expose the precise financial records that would have revealed the full scope of his thefts. He stood to lose not only his freedom, but everything the family name represented, the social position and the professional standing and the particular form of identity that had been constructed around being a Murdaugh in Hampton County. The theory was that he killed his wife and son in order to redirect attention, to generate a wave of public sympathy so overwhelming that the financial investigation would be paused or derailed, to put his own body in the position of a man who had lost everything, because that man would be difficult to prosecute for theft. It was, if this theory is correct, a calculation so cold and so catastrophic that it collapses the ordinary human categories we use to understand behavior. But the practical answers, while they may be accurate, do not fully satisfy. Because the question of why in cases like this one is not only a question about motive in the legal sense. It is a question about the interior life of the person who did it, about the sequence of experiences and choices and self-narrations that produced a man capable of this act. It is a question about what happens inside a person over decades of sustained deception. What happens to the interior life of someone who has been lying so completely and for so long that the self which is doing the lying has perhaps lost track of anything that might have once served as a limit. Alex Murdaugh sat in the courtroom in Walterboro in the winter of 2023 and testified in his own defense. He admitted to lying to investigators. He admitted to financial crimes. He admitted to the addiction. He denied killing his wife and son with a consistency that his attorneys maintained throughout the proceedings. He wept on the stand. He described finding the bodies. He described a grief that appeared, to anyone watching, to be real. The jury did not believe him. After approximately 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on both counts of murder. Alex Murdaugh was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison. He would never leave a prison cell. The Murdaugh name, which had defined legal authority in Hampton County for 3 generations, ended in a courtroom in the particular way that things end when they have been built on a foundation that was never what it appeared to be. But the verdict, as definitive as it was, did not resolve everything. It resolved the legal question of who was criminally responsible. It did not resolve the deeper, quieter questions that continue to surround this case. The questions about what Maggie knew and when she knew it. The questions about what Paul's inner life contained in those final months. The questions about how a community and an institution and a family could have sustained so much concealed wrongdoing for so long without the concealment collapsing earlier. The Murdaugh story is, among other things, a story about systems. It is a story about what happens when a single family occupies a position of institutional authority long enough that the institution and the family become indistinguishable. When the man who is supposed to represent the law is himself above the law, not explicitly, not through any formal declaration, but through the accumulated social understanding of a community that has learned, across 3 generations, to extend a particular deference, then the system that is supposed to provide accountability has been quietly hollowed out from within. The people in Hampton County who suspected, or half suspected, or knew pieces of the truth about Alex Murdaugh's financial dealings over the years were not all cowards. Many of them were simply people who had learned, through lived experience, that the Murdaugh name protected itself, and that challenging it had costs that challenging ordinary people did not have. This is how institutional corruption sustains itself, not primarily through active suppression, but through the passive learned behavior of a community that has been trained to look away. The lawyers and accountants and financial institutions that processed Alex's transactions over the years, the people who might have noticed irregularities or asked harder questions or followed a thread that would have led somewhere uncomfortable, operated inside the same cultural architecture. The Murdaugh name provided cover not just through intimidation, but through the far more powerful mechanism of reputation. People simply did not believe, on a deep level, that a Murdaugh would do something like this. The belief in the family's fundamental respectability was so entrenched that it functioned as a cognitive filter, causing people to interpret ambiguous information in ways that preserved the existing narrative rather than challenging it. This mechanism is not unique to Hampton County. It operates in communities and institutions all over the world. It is the mechanism that allows abuse to continue inside churches and schools and corporations and families long after enough information exists to stop it, because the accumulated social capital of the perpetrator continues to be sufficient to redirect doubt outward and away. It is the mechanism that women, particularly, have encountered in the most painful ways when they have tried to raise concerns about powerful men and found that the community's investment in those men's reputations was greater than its investment in their own safety. After the verdict, after the sentencing, after the extraordinary media coverage had moved on to the next compelling story, the people of Hampton County were left with something that communities are always left with after this kind of revelation. They were left with the work of understanding, which is harder and slower and less satisfying than the work of conviction. They were left asking themselves how it had been possible, who had known what, whether there were things they could have done differently, warnings they had missed or ignored or dismissed, moments when the architecture of the deception had briefly shown its seams and they had chosen not to look. These questions do not have clean answers. They rarely do in the aftermath of revelations like this one. The human capacity for self-examination is real, but it is also self-protective, and most communities, most individuals, arrive at some accommodation between the truth and the story they can bear to tell about themselves. The Moselle Estate stood empty in the months after the trial. The property, like so many properties associated with violent history, became a site of the macabre tourism that our culture inevitably generates around places where terrible things happened. People drove out from the highway to look at it. They photographed it through their car windows. They stood at the edge of the long private road and looked down toward the house they could barely see and tried to feel something that matched the scale of what had happened there. What does a place feel like after this? What does it feel like to stand on land that carries this particular weight? The live oaks are still there. The Spanish moss still moves in whatever breeze finds its way through the low country air. The fields are still green in the spring and heavy in the summer and melancholy in the fall. The land does not know what happened on it. The land does not carry guilt or grief or the moral weight of human choices. It simply continues, as land does, patient and indifferent, and unchanged by the events that human beings enact upon its surface. But we are not land. We carry things. We carry the knowledge of what happened in places, and that knowledge changes the places for us, even when the places themselves remain unchanged. Standing at the edge of the Moselle Estate now, knowing what you know, the beauty of the low country light through the Spanish moss takes on a different quality. The silence that might once have seemed peaceful seems to hold something else now. The echo of a life that was more complicated and more terrible than it appeared. The echo of a woman driving toward the estate on a June evening. The echo of a young man at the kennels with his dogs. The Beach family, the family of Mallory, the 19-year-old who did not survive the boat accident, lived through years of watching the Murdaugh legal proceedings from a position of extraordinary pain. They had lost their daughter and their sister to the recklessness of a young man whose family had the resources and the institutional connections to slow the path of accountability. They then had to watch that family become the centre of a murder investigation and a trial and a media phenomenon that consumed the public's attention in ways that sometimes felt, to people in their position, uncomfortably removed from the actual human losses at the centre of the story. Their grief was not hypothetical. Their grief was the grief of specific, irreplaceable loss, the grief of a chair at the table that would always be empty, the grief of future events, graduations and weddings, and ordinary Tuesdays, from which Mallory would always be absent. They had to carry that grief through years of legal proceedings and then through the emergence of an entirely different legal narrative, and the carrying of it, the sustained engagement with a public process that repeatedly brought their worst moment back into public view, required a kind of strength that most people will never be called upon to demonstrate. They were, in many ways, invisible in the dominant narrative of the Murdaugh story, a narrative that, like most narratives involving powerful families, found the family more compelling than the people the family had harmed. This invisibility is a pattern worth naming. In stories involving wealthy and well-connected perpetrators, the perpetrators' stories tend to dominate the cultural space, their psychology analysed and debated and documented, while the people they harmed occupy a peripheral position, referenced primarily as motivators for the central story, rather than as fully realised subjects of their own. The Murdaugh case attracted attention on a scale that few criminal proceedings achieve. The combination of factors that made it compelling, the old family name, the multi-generational institutional power, the extent and variety of the crimes, the particular horror of family violence, the setting in the storied landscape of the American South, the live-streamed trial, produced a story that felt almost operatic in its dimensions, almost too large to be real. And that very scale, that operatic quality, risked producing in its audience a kind of aesthetic distance, a response to the story as spectacle rather than as the account of real human lives and real human losses. This is a tension that exists inside every true crime story and that every thoughtful person who engages with this genre has to negotiate. The stories are real. The losses are real. The people who died were not characters. They were Maggie, who was 52 years old and warm and funny and deserving of decades more of life. They were Paul, who was 22 and complicated and young enough that the full shape of who he might have become was still forming. They were Mallory, who was 19 and whose death set the rest of this in motion, whose family has been carrying the weight of her absence ever since. Telling their stories carefully, insisting on their full humanity rather than reducing them to their roles in a narrative, is the least we can do. It is the minimum of respect that this genre owes to the people whose lives it trades in. Alex Murdaugh, as of the time of this narration, is serving his sentence. The financial crimes resulted in additional convictions. The full accounting of the damage he caused, measured in stolen money and stolen futures, and the lives permanently altered by his choices, is staggering. The Murdaugh law firm, PMPED, dissolved. The three-generation legal dynasty that had defined Hampton County's relationship to the law came to an end. In Hampton County itself, the aftermath of the Murdaugh revelations has involved something that communities rarely undertake willingly, a genuine reckoning with the questions of what was enabled and by whom and for how long. There have been investigations into the handling of past cases, into the deaths that had occurred in Murdaugh-adjacent circumstances over the years, into the ways in which institutional deference to the family name had perhaps shaped decisions and outcomes in ways that served the family rather than the community. This reckoning is ongoing. It is uncomfortable. It is necessary. There are other deaths, other cases, other threads that continue to be pulled. The death of Stephen Smith, a young man whose body was found on a road in Hampton County in 2015, a death that was originally ruled a hit and run, but that investigators have revisited in the context of the Murdaugh revelations, has attracted renewed attention and produced questions that remain unanswered. The investigation into Smith's death continues. His mother, Sandy, has spent years seeking answers and has been public and persistent in her belief that the original investigation was inadequate and that her son's death deserves a fuller accounting. This thread, this additional layer of unresolved uncertainty, is a reminder that the Murdaugh story is not simply the story of a single dramatic trial with a clean verdict. It is the story of an ecosystem of power and protection that extended over decades and touched more lives than have yet been fully accounted for. The verdict in the murder trial resolved one chapter. But the full story, the story of what a family's multi-generational institutional power can enable and conceal in a small community over a long period of time, is still being written. The Moselle Estate was eventually sold. The property that had been in the family's orbit for generations passed to new owners who would have to decide what to do with land that carries the particular history it now carries. This is a question that new owners of historically troubled properties always face, not a legal question, but a moral and psychological one. Do you try to make the land new again, to fill it with new associations and new memories and new life? Or does the land hold what happened on it in some way that cannot simply be overwritten? The live oaks do not answer this question. The Spanish moss does not answer it. The low country light, moving through the canopy in its pale, uncertain way, does not answer it. These are questions for the people who carry the stories, which means they are questions for us. For everyone who has followed this case and tried to understand it and tried to hold its human dimensions in proper perspective. What do we do with a story like this one? What does it tell us that we can use? It tells us something about the way power protects itself in small communities and large institutions alike. It tells us something about the psychological cost of sustained deception, not only on the deceiver, but on the people living in proximity to the deception, the people who absorb its effects without knowing the cause. It tells us something about the particular vulnerability of women whose sense of security is built on foundations they have not been permitted or encouraged to fully examine. And it tells us something about the importance of accountability, not only legal accountability, but social accountability. The kind that a community exercises collectively when it refuses to extend deference simply on the basis of a name. Would you have trusted them? Sitting in that house on a Sunday afternoon, watching the ease with which Alex moved through a room, the grace with which Maggie managed everything, the comfortable normalcy of a successful Southern family on their beautiful estate, would you have sensed that something was wrong? Would you have noticed the quality of the silences, the particular way that certain topics were never quite directly addressed? Would you have registered the look that crossed someone's face for a fraction of a second before the practiced expression was restored? Most of us would not have. Most of us would have seen exactly what we were meant to see, which is precisely the point. The most effective deceptions are the ones that feel most like comfort. The most dangerous situations are sometimes the ones that most resemble safety. This is not a counsel of paranoia. It is a counsel of attention, of the particular kind of attention that refuses to accept surfaces as their own evidence, that remains willing to notice what the architecture of a situation is designed to conceal. Maggie Murdaugh deserved better. She deserved to have been in a world where the things that were true about her husband had been visible, had been accountable, had been confronted before they reached their worst conclusion. She deserved to have been seen, not as a supporting character in the story of a powerful man, but as a full human being, with her own claim on safety and truth, and the ordinary expectation that the people who love us will not be the source of our greatest danger. Paul Murdaugh deserved better too, in a different way, and for different reasons. He was a young man who had made terrible choices and was beginning, however slowly and imperfectly, to live with their consequences. He was 22 years old. The full arc of a life at 22 is still, in most imaginable circumstances, ahead of you. He should have been allowed to grow up, to grapple with what he had done, to perhaps find some path toward making things more right than they were. That possibility was taken from him, and Mallory Beach deserved better from the very beginning. She deserved to get on a boat with people who would bring her home safely. She deserved to turn 19 and then 20 and then all the years after that. She deserved everything that was taken from her on that river, and her family deserved to have received something other than the systematic exploitation of their grief that followed. All of them are gone now, and we are left with the story and with the question of what we do with it. The true crime genre, at its best, is not entertainment. It is not the comfortable experience of being safely frightened by events that happen to other people at a safe remove. At its best, it is an act of witness. It is the decision to look carefully at something difficult and to resist the temptation to look away, to stay with the complexity and the discomfort and the moral unease, to refuse to reduce real human lives to the dimensions of a satisfying narrative. Whispering Estates exists in that belief, that these stories matter not because they are dramatic, though they often are, but because they tell us something true about human lives and human systems, and the ways in which the most important dangers are sometimes the most invisible ones. That the houses we build, and the names we inherit, and the lives we construct can contain things we have not examined, and that the failure to examine them has consequences that extend beyond the individual, into families and communities and the long, ongoing story of what we owe to each other. The Moselle Estate is quiet now, or perhaps it is not quiet, Perhaps new owners have filled it with new noise, new routines, new dogs in those kennels, new voices in those rooms. Perhaps the land is simply doing what land does, continuing, patient, and unchanged. But somewhere in the history of that place, in the particular quality of air that hangs over the low country in the long southern summer, the story remains. Not as a ghost story, not as something supernatural or inexplicable, as the story of ordinary human things taken to their most terrible conclusion. Ambition and entitlement and addiction and fear and the particular violence of a man who had constructed his entire life on the premise that the consequences that governed others would never reach him. They reached him. They reached Maggie first. They reached Paul first. They reached the people whose money he stole, and the people whose grief he exploited, and the community whose trust his family had spent 3 generations cultivating. They reached all of them long before the jury delivered its verdict. And what remains after the verdict, after the sentence, after the estate is sold, and the firm is dissolved, and the name begins its slow drift toward historical, rather than living significance, is the human truth at the center of all of it. That the people we live with are not always who we believe them to be. That the homes we feel safe in can contain what we have not been permitted to see. That safety, real safety, the kind worth having, is built not on surface and reputation and the accumulated social capital of a name, but on something slower and more difficult and more honest. Maggie Murdaugh knew what it was to be loved by a community that did not fully see her. She knew what it was to carry the weight of a family whose foundations she may not have been allowed to examine. She knew what it was to be a woman inside a life that was organized around the needs and the image and the imperatives of a man whose inner life was hidden from her in the most consequential possible way. She deserved to have been able to put that weight down while she was still alive to feel the relief of it. The live oaks at the edge of the Moselle Estate hold their Spanish moss like memory. The fields lie quiet in the late afternoon light. The long private road where the yellow tape was strung and the sheriff's vehicles were parked at their crooked angles leads to a house that is no longer what it was, that is no longer the center of anything, that is simply a place now. A structure on a piece of land in a county in the American South, and somewhere between the surface of the story and the depth of it, between the drama and the quiet, between the verdict and the questions that the verdict did not answer, Maggie and Paul remain. Not as victims, not as cautionary tales, not as characters in someone else's narrative, but as people. As the specific, irreplaceable people they were, in the specific, irreplaceable lives they lived. On the specific summer evening, when those lives ended in the dark, on the land that their family had held for generations. We will never know everything. We will never have access to the interior of the moments that matter most. The moment Maggie turned off the highway toward home. The moment Paul looked up from the kennels. The moment the ordinary evening became the last ordinary evening. These moments belong only to the people who were in them, and those people are gone. What we have is the story. What we have is the obligation to tell it carefully, to hold its full weight without sensationalizing it, to refuse the easy satisfactions of a narrative that makes tragedy feel clean. What we have is the responsibility to remember that every case in this genre, every property that whispers its secrets to those willing to listen, is not a story. It is the trace of lives. We are grateful you spent this time with us here at Whispering Estates. These stories matter because the people inside them mattered. If this felt like something you want to return to, we would be honored to have you stay. There are more houses, more histories, more silences that deserve to be heard. We will be here, listening carefully, for all of them. The light over the Moselle Estate changes as the afternoon moves toward evening. The live oaks cast their long shadows across the fields. The air thickens with the particular weight of the low country at dusk. And the land, patient and indifferent and unchanged, simply continues, as land does, holding its history in the only way that land knows how to hold anything, which is to say, simply by remaining.